Yeah. Just my take on things. My answer to number 2. Guide discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Those cognitive distortions decrease until they cease. Let's go. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs.
I think we're recording. Welcome back, everybody, to Peplow's Ghost. I am your host, Dr. Dan Weisman, and joined with my co-host, Dr. Melissa Chapman-Hayes. I am thrilled with our next guest here, Marcus Evans, another one of our international guests, which is great. And again, just was saying before we started recording, really want to say thank you to sacrificing a bit of your Friday afternoon/evening here to join us and really kind of get to know you a little bit on this podcast. So thank you so much. I've got a quick introduction for Marcus, but I'm sure he'll be able to kind of explain himself a lot better than I will since he knows himself. But Marcus is got a lot of vast experience here. He's been practicing for over 40 years. I read that he's been in private practice in Beckenham, which is in the UK, since 1995. Is that accurate? Yep.
That's right. No. Yes, more or less. Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. I was going to say, it seems like these days it's all BC, before COVID. It's been a while since you've been in private practice. So
yeah.
You're an accomplished author. You've got a few texts out there that I'm happy to mention. I'm going to feel free to correct me if I'm getting the title wrong, but the one of them, Making Room for Madness in Mental Health, and then one focused on gender dysphoria, a therapeutic approach for working with children, adolescent, and young adults. So I don't want to kind of go too much into just the introduction. Again, I think Marcus is amazing and can't wait to hear kind of his story. And that's maybe where I'll start. Just kind of, if you wouldn't mind, Marcus, kind of taking us back in a time machine and just kind of what's got you kind of on this path and where did you start? What sort of life experiences kind of led you in this direction? So, and thanks again for being here.
So as an 18-year-old, I didn't really know what I was going to do and who would pay me for doing anything. So I was a bit of a lost soul and but quite good with people. So I trained as a psychiatric nurse. That was in 1980, or over 45 years ago. And during the course of the time on the wards, the thing that I learned the most, I didn't learn a lot from school, but I learned quite a lot from seeing the patients and from staff that I admired and the way they would interact with people. But I found that the biological model, I'm not against medication, or I'll say something about diagnosis in a bit, but it didn't really explain to me why I was seeing patients who were quite disturbed and had been for a very long time, sort of living in their own world. And I came across a psychotherapist. This is when I was about 19, working on one of the back wards. These are the old asylum wards where people have been there for years. And he was trying to think about the patients and the patient's behaviour, and I got interested. And I started to, this is concertinaing a very long story, but I started to read Melanie Klein, didn't understand much, but I intuitively thought she was talking a lot of sense. And then I qualified as a nurse in 1983. I eventually ended up running a day hospital when I was quite young, and then a parasuicide service. But all along, from probably 1985, I started to do psychotherapy trainings. I trained at the Tavistock, did an introductory course, then an intermediate course, and decided that I wanted to train as a psychotherapist, and luckily managed to persuade the Tavistock to accept me for a 4-year adult psychotherapy training. I was working at the Maudsley at the time, so I was seconded. When I finished that training, they were criticised by a report in which they said they didn't do enough for nurses. And they did a lot in terms of training. It's the sort of national psychotherapy training institution. And they do a lot for psychotherapy, but not a lot for practicing nurses. So they headhunted me, basically, and I was employed by the Tavistock as the first nurse in something like, it was about 1986. In our National Health Service, was a national service that is run by public institutions. And why I said I've been in private practice since 1996 is I'd had a small private practice running alongside my major job, which was, as the chief executive of the trust said, look, I want to set up a nursing discipline, and you are to set up trainings that would be offered to nurses working in psychiatric and general settings, actually. And that's what I set about doing. And that was in about 1996, after I qualified as an adult psychotherapist.
Wonderful.
My passion, actually, I've sort of written 3 books, and I've got a 4th coming out. 2 are on gender dysphoria. One is coming out called Identity and the Foundational Myth. But the second book is called Psychoanalytic Thinking in Mental Health Settings, and it's a book designed for sort of interested psychiatrists, psychiatric nurse psychologists who are interested in looking at what psychoanalysis has got to offer psychiatric settings. And that is really my sort of passion. So I work as a psychoanalyst. I'm a fellow now trained as a fellow of the Institute of Psychoanalysis here in Great Britain. But what I'm known for is the application of psychoanalytic ideas to, say, patients with borderline personality disorder or psychotic patients, partly in treatment. And I was fortunate in working in the Tavistock. I had a sort of clinical setting where I could take on patients that wouldn't ordinarily be seen in private practice. People with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia or anorexia or personality disorder. So I'd see patients, and then I'd, do my best to try and understand them and see if what I had to offer helped. And then I would consult to frontline nursing staff in psychiatric settings, inpatient units, day hospitals, and consult to them in terms of saying, okay, let's talk about a case and let's see if I've got anything to contribute. And what I'm saying really is the 2 dovetail. So my clinical experience of working with the patients was then helpful when thinking about what community psychiatric nurses were faced with when dealing with someone who's self-harm or cutting on a Friday afternoon. And that's really what I've been doing since, about 1990. Ploughing the same furrow, working clinically, but then consulting to psychiatric settings.
Wonderful, Marcus. It's hitting home to a lot of things, reflecting on my own life. You mentioned, just being 18 and kind of lost. That's kind of where I started to. I just joined the military, and because I was really lost and didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and found the military, like you said, kind of paid for, room and board and everything for a while. And and then you were kind of working in a day hospital, which is something that I've done as well, and has been really kind of meaningful and impactful for me too, because the day hospital, it's formerly called the partial hospital program, was so nice in that you could do the therapy and kind of the medications, because it was an outpatient practice. I don't know if that's kind of what your experiences was. So we didn't have kind of psychiatrists or prescribing. I mean, they were just seeing them once every 3 months or something. So the real work was psychotherapy. And so that was really where I cut my teeth and really kind of learned to help people without a prescription pad. So yeah, thank you for sharing your story. That's been, like I said, just hit home a couple areas. So I wonder if Melissa has any questions at this time.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed hearing about your background and the dovetailing of those 2 areas. And I wanted to ask a question that kind of builds upon how you've written extensively about working psychoanalytically with psychosis. So often, sometimes that's the population that's seen as beyond talking therapy. What have you learned from these patients about the value and limits of psychoanalytic understanding?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when I was 19 and I came across Melanie Klein, I thought, patients in psychotic conditions could be cured by psychoanalysis. That's not what I think now. What I do think is that there's 2 things. One is that my experience is that some patients, very ill, can benefit from having someone who's trying to understand, what it's like to be in their shoes. So one guy who I saw and wrote about, was very isolated, living in a world of his own a lot of the time, and felt terribly humiliated because he wasn't so psychotic that he was sort of completely living in his delusional world. He was aware that he didn't fit in. He was, nearly 50 years of age and had nothing to say about politics, so he couldn't join in with conversations. And one of his problems was when he caught sight of just how unwell he was, he would become, very shamed and start to feel quite suicidal because that insight was painful. In fact, I called the paper Catch-22, that he's sort of looking for insight, but the insight was too painful to bear. And, I would struggle to understand some of the time the world that he lived in, but he felt he got enough out of the sessions. And I obviously understood enough from time to time that he kept coming and he really valued it. But I wouldn't say that psychotherapy is for everyone with a severe and enduring mental illness. But what I do feel is that even, even patients in the most disturbed states of mind hope to meet staff who are curious and interested in who they are and what their symptoms mean. If they're met, they can be in rather schizoid, cut-off state, and then they meet a system that can be rather schizoid and cut off, because let's face it, being with patients in disturbed states of mind is disturbing, and staff can withdraw behind very procedural ways of thinking. And I always assume that the patient wants to be met by staff who are interested in who they are. And I think psychoanalysis gives a lens for thinking about that. The patient does all sorts of, is in a bizarre state of mind or may act out in violent ways. And I'm always encouraging the staff to think, but who is the person behind that presentation? Because there's something driving this. And if one could get an angle on that, then in a way you find a sort of different way of relating with the individual. So anyway, long answer. So I think that psychoanalytic thinking has got a lot to contribute to thinking about patients, even if they're not in psychoanalytic settings or treatment. Try and humanize the sort of contact. And also, you get into repetitive patterns, don't you, of, the patient's on special observations and is in danger of harming themselves, but then they go on weekend leave and they come back quite happily, and then you withdraw the special observation and the patient acts out. Now, sometimes staff find that very perplexing. Of course you would. It sort of doesn't make any sense. But if you understand that the patient feels they need to have people worried and concerned about them because they can't manage themselves, then to some extent they've got to sort of keep the sort of maximum amount of supervision and oversight because they feel frightened without it. And they worry if they think, okay, you're well enough to go home at the weekend, you must be okay. And then they feel that the support's going to be withdrawn, and then that provokes a sort of regression and acting out and one thing or another. Well, that can be really helpful to members of staff who are struggling to understand why the patient is repeating these sorts of destructive acts. Anyway, this is just an example.
I appreciate the examples, and particularly the humanizing aspect of it that you brought in. Thank you.
Yeah, and I really like the idea too. If like you said, if you can offer a frame for people, I think that helps you kind of, like you just said, Melissa, kind of humanize and just kind of understand that person a little bit better, and that depth of understanding. From my experience, again, going back to my days working in a partial hospital program, for me, it was more kind of, we incorporated a model of dialectical behavioral therapy, which was kind of, at the time, kind of revolutionary to think of that people who are harming themselves, weren't doing it just for attention. I mean, there was this constant, real cynical kind of view that it was just for attention seeking. But again, kind of take a step back and look at their pain in a different lens. I think, and then offers you a way to help them, I think, is the other thing. Because I think you spoke to that as well. As I think a lot of nurses on these units want to help. They all, they got on the unit, they look for these jobs because they want to help. But then they get to these environments that sometimes aren't conducive to the most therapeutic processes as well. So, yeah, it's also, reminds me of, I think last time we recorded, Dr. Sean Conboy kind of said, it's a more about your zip code than your DNA code. And so, yeah, your environment has such a dramatic impact on how you behave. And so thank you for sharing those and bringing those things up too. I guess when you were talking,
just one other thing, I was just going to say, one of the problems is when we're confronted by things we understand, we can get quite moralistic or judgmental, isn't it? That often the patient's called manipulative. Now, if you're talking about someone with EUPD or borderline personality disorder, their whole, my sort of frame would be there's quite a fragile ego with a very judgmental superego, quite a difficulty tolerating anxiety or conflictual feelings, and that gets projected very powerfully into the therapist or the nurse. Now, the thing is that, and it can sort of get under their skin. I wrote a paper called Being Driven Mad, because the patient gets under your skin, and then there's a tendency to sort of react rather than sort of digest. And, to some extent, the patient may be controlling the discourse, but that's described as manipulation, whereas I would think it's to do with how fragile the patient feels and how much they need a certain sort of containment. And, of course, they may either seduce or threaten if that is threatened to be taken away, but it's more to do with an underlying fragility and dependence upon the other's care than it is to do with manipulation. I mean, one's got to keep an open mind about these things. I'm not saying, with patients who've got perverse problems, then sometimes there is a wish to, exploit, project guilt and exploit responsibility. It's not that it never happens, but when we retreat to a sort of moralistic position as a first sort of port of call because we're frustrated, it's sort of unhelpful to the therapeutic situation.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I want to kind of maybe change gears a little bit, but keep talking about this conversation. But it's, again, another thing you've mentioned, and part of, why we generated or why we, continue to do this podcast and what keeps me going and really kind of energizes me in my work is that, this, and I think we struggle with this. And so I'd just love to hear your perspective of, where do meds and therapy, where does that balance, where does that dynamic kind of fit in? And because I think when you're talking about, people, who have psychosis, it's not, psychoanalysis isn't going to be for everyone. That's true. And same with meds. And, I think Dr. Brooke Finley was on and she said that she thinks that 70% of people on meds could probably come off of meds if they got into some good psychotherapy. But again, just from your perspective, Marcus, where do you see that line, and where does that for you conceptually kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, my experience is that, I'd be referred someone from the psychiatric service down the road to this specialist hospital at Tavistock, which hasn't got any beds or day hospitals. It's just outpatient psychotherapy. And I would always say to someone with, let's say, diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, I'd say, look, yes, I'll take you on, but I'm going to work with your psychiatric team. I don't want you to be discharged, because if the patient breaks down, I'm going to be phoning up the psychiatrist. So I want that link to be continued. Now, some patients would accept that as the sort of deal, but others would say, no, I want to get away from psychiatry. I feel it's stigmatizing. The problem for me was then we're creating a setting as if I'm going to say, look, I'm going to be able to manage all your psychotic symptoms on my own by just my understanding. Now, that to me is sort of therapeutic omnipotence, and actually makes the patient feel, that they're quite excited because they've met this omnipotent figure. So I've got.
Did you coin that term? Did you? Is that your term, or I love it?
No, yeah. But
maybe you need to trademark it. I don't know. Sorry, interrupted.
Yeah, but no, that's fine. But the thing is that, unlike some of my psychoanalytic colleagues, psychiatrists who worked at the Maudsley, which is our big psychiatric institution, who are very much against diagnosis, full stop, I'm not against diagnosis as a ballpark thing. I think it's helpful for in terms of understanding what the sort of likely prognosis. Look, you can't rely on prognosis of diagnosis. We act as if it is a science. It's more of an art, psychiatry. But if you've got someone who's got a history of psychotic breakdowns, it's helpful to know it. I wouldn't feel it's appropriate to take them on in private practice, for example. I just don't have the setting. I've tried it, but that's why I would see people in the Tavistock, because I had the support of colleagues. Now, the thing is that, so I think the sort of ballpark diagnosis, what are we dealing with? A psychotic condition, personality disorder, or neurotic is quite helpful. The problem is when we become over-reliant. It doesn't tell us anything about the individual. Also, prognostically, we don't know who's going to become very withdrawn and living in a delusional world of their own, and who's going to actually be able to get on with their lives and get a job and one thing and another. So, I'm sort of, I like diagnostic categories, provided we adding the thing that this is an individual and we're interested in finding the individual, if you see what I mean. So we're combining the two.
Yeah.
Medication is also helpful when patients are in very disturbed states of mind. They can't manage their own mind. They're bursting out of their mind. There's, smashing up the ward or attacking their mother or whatever. And I'm not going to give magical interpretations that can contain that. It wouldn't be realistic. The problem with the medication is we tend to idealize it. And we act as if this is a sort of magic bullet which will get rid of the psychosis. Well, with some patients it does, and they recover from their psychosis. With others, that they live with a psychotic part of their organization for years. And they to talk as if we could eradicate a part of themselves actually persecutes them, and they feel like they're a failure because the medication hasn't worked. There must be something wrong with them. So I sort of feel that with the diagnosis and the medication, the problem is it's so tempting to use it as a sort of magic bullet, which actually bypasses the fact that people need a lot more than just medication. They need, if you've got a fragile ego and you're prone to becoming psychotic, you need a rehab team and a good psychiatrist and someone who's going to support your family if you're lucky enough to be still in a family, because they become your asylum. You're going to need all sorts of things, not just, the latest antipsychotic medication. They're all improving, by the way, but they're not magic. Anyway, so long answer to your
I was just
question.
No, Marcus, I think that's, because I've seen people at the podium stumble with that question. Like, when to use medications, when to use therapy. And I think your answer is, again, going to be biased here, of course, myself, but I think your answer is perfect. We don't want to reduce people to just diagnosis or, some looking at a magic bullet as far as a pill to kind of take care of everything. So, yeah. I'll
just say two other things. One is that sometimes, a mild amount of antipsychotic medication can make can help the patient bear their emotional pain, and then they become available for therapy. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing, the direction of travel in psychiatry. I'm a critical friend. I like psychiatry, but it's sort of going down a sort of road of becoming more and more obsessional with DSMs and ICDs, and like as if we could sort of pinpoint the precise, sort of point on the scale that this person has got OCD. And I think that sort of obsessionality is just not helpful at all. It turns psychiatry into this belief that if only we can get the science right, we're going to actually nail the diagnosis and then the treatment, and all our problems will be solved. It becomes so mechanistic, and it doesn't relate to my experience of people who are suffering, and they suffer in a particular way. And how do we help understand who they are and why and what their symptoms mean in terms of their attempts to manage their difficulties?
Yeah. No. It's for me, I mean, even with myself from a day to day, it's where does that line between whatever we would call normal and abnormal, right? Not diagnosed to diagnosed, like you're saying, OCD. I mean, we're all a little obsessive, we're all a little compulsive at times. It's not a terrible thing if we, can manage it, but where is that line? And that's even for myself that, I have to do that self-reflection and say, which side of the fence am I waking up today on? So, I think we're getting close on time. So Melissa, I think you got another question if you want to ask Marcus.
Thank you. So looking forward and thinking about the future of psychoanalytic nursing, what advice might you have to offer the next generation of psychiatric nurses in trying to integrate psychoanalytic thinking into modern practice?
I think one's always got to be skeptical of any approach, and I am passionate about psychoanalysis, but I think one's always got to be skeptical of anyone who claims in psychiatry that there's one approach which has got all the answers. That's not my experience. There's someone, with a psychiatric disturbance, they're going to need all sorts of people. Occupational therapy is undervalued in my view. But I do think the psychoanalytic lens, which helps sort of take notice of the symptoms or the acting out, but sees past to who is this individual and what are they struggling with, and then to understand the way the individual might go through habitual patterns in relation to their carers and nurses and psychiatrists, and often that can be very frustrating. So it's got so many tools that can help the nurses think about their patients. And for me, it makes life much more interesting. You're trying to sort of think, is why I went into psychiatry is like, what makes people tick? Myself, other people. Why don't I do sensible things if I'm trying to lose weight, which I am? Why do I keep having curries on a Friday night? These sorts of things, as you were saying, Dan, that we all struggle with. Well, it just makes nursing much more interesting, and it helps throw light on these sometimes frustrating patterns of behaviour, and I think it's unique in doing that.
Love it. Yeah, I think it again makes me think of people I've talked to before and going into practice, and they're seeing 25, 30 patients a day, and they're just doing medication refills, and after a year or two, they just get burned out. I mean, they just become kind of a dry husk of themselves, and they forget, like just what you said, like they forget why they got into this. They forget the curiosity of getting to know that person, which again for me kind of fills my cup, and so that's great. Any last words before we wrap up today, Marcus?
No, it's nice to have met you both, and more power to your elbow.
Yeah,
we need more of this. We need more of this. We need it in the UK as well.
I know,
I run a course with the Institute of Psychoanalysis, which some Americans have come on, which is basically me talking about, say, psychoanalytic understanding of borderline states. And I mean, and people are so interested, and you say nurses aren't that interested or psychiatrists aren't. Well, they are. But, I'm sort of trying to talk to them about their experiences on wards, I try not to talk too much about my own clinical experience because it's so far removed, the privilege of being with someone for 50 minutes. And by the way, they're a neurotic patient who's got a job and a family, and the nurse is dealing with, someone who's borderline personality disorder who keeps breaking up in relationships and then cuts and burns themselves. The nurse thinks that's miles away from what I'm dealing with on the ward. So, it's trying to apply the sort of analytic thinking to psychiatric settings.
Yeah.
But you guys are doing the same thing, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think, it's fascinating for me too. I think, there's obviously different healthcare systems with the socialist NHS in the UK, obviously more private here in the United States, but we're all struggling with the same thing. We're all kind of struggling to figure this out. So that kind of reassures me that I'm not doing too bad here, because I mean, we're all struggling. We're all kind of on this ship sailing along in the universe. And so thank you again to Marcus Evans. And if you like what he says, got, again, lots of books, just Amazon his name. I'm sure you'll find plenty of text there. But again, if you're interested also in getting involved, I'll set links to his website as well as other ways to get in touch with him. So thank you again, Marcus. It's been a pleasure to meet you and get to talk to you. And thanks so much. Take care.
Pleasure to meet you both.
Therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving, so you can be you. They feel it, therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving, so you can be you. Guided discovery. Identify and challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease. Yeah, guided discovery. Identify and challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease.